Winston lay stretched out by the window, his eyes following raindrops sliding down the glass. The majestic presence of a German shepherd who had served in the police force had faded. His body was still large, his black-brown coat still glossy, but Winston's gaze had changed. 8 years of service. 4 medals of courage and countless solved cases, all just distant memories since he came to live with Frank and his ex-wife. The small suburban house where Winston now lived was different. No more clear commands, no more daily missions. Instead, there was quiet, sometimes too quiet, and the dog bed placed in the corner of the living room. The bed, Winston's most precious possession, where he could curl up, feel safe, and still observe the entire house Frank had just left for work. Winston enjoyed these quiet mornings. He moved from the window to his bed, turned 3 times, and lay down head resting on the edge of the bed so he could see the door. His breathing slowed. Winston drifted into sleep, dreaming of his glorious days as a brave service dog. Strange sounds from the back door woke Winston. His ears stood straight, his body tensed. Had Frank returned early? No. These footsteps were different, lighter, and there was Frank's voice talking to someone. Winston cautiously approached the kitchen door. "Winston, come meet our new guests." Frank knelt, holding a cardboard box. From inside, Winston heard small movements and smelled a strange scent. A wild smell instinct told Winston to be cautious. Frank placed the box on the kitchen floor, found them in the backyard. Their mother is gone, probably hunted. 3 small creatures stepped out of the box. Winston backed up a step. Bobcats, but not ordinary house cats. Bobcat kittens with their characteristic ears with black tufts at the tips, spotted fur, and short tails. Winston had once faced an adult bobcat during a mission tracking criminals into the forest. Not a pleasant memory. The 3 kittens looked around. The largest, with dark stripes on his back, went straight to Winston's water bowl and began drinking. The second, with lighter fur, sneaked along the wall, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. The smallest, with a rare white spot on her ear, stood in the middle of the room, looking directly at Winston with curiosity. Frank named them immediately: Bossy, Sneaky, and Tiny. He laughed, pointing to each one. "Just temporary, Winston, until we find a suitable place for them." Winston wasn't sure what temporary meant, but he knew his world had just changed. The first night, he didn't dare sleep. His eyes wide open, watching the 3 intruders from the furthest corner of the living room. A week passed. Temporary seemed to last longer than Winston thought, and his territory was being invaded bit by bit. First was the kitchen. Bossy decided that the feeding area belonged to the cats. Winston found his food bowl pushed into the corner, and whenever he approached, Bossy would slightly hiss, a small sound, but enough to make Winston back away. He had gotten used to yielding after years of living with Frank's ex-wife who never liked him. Next was the sofa. Sneaky started taking afternoon naps on the cushion where Winston usually lay. Whenever Winston approached, Sneaky would curl up, stare intently, and Winston felt uneasy. He told himself that the cushion wasn't that important. He could lie on the floor. But then one afternoon, Winston returned from a walk with Frank and discovered all 3 bobcat kittens curled up on his bed. His bed. The only possession, the only place in the house that truly belonged to him. Bossy lay in the center, looking defiant. Sneaky curled up in one corner, eyes half closed but still watchful. Tiny, though sleeping, still occupied a significant portion of the bed. Winston stood there hesitating. Part of him, the part that had been a brave service dog, wanted to chase away the intruders. But another part, the part that had learned to bow his head and avoid conflict, won out. He sighed, turned away, and lay down on the cold wooden floor. Frank saw everything. That night, when the bobcat kittens finally left the bed to explore the backyard, Winston still didn't dare approach. He lay on the floor, head resting on his paws. Sad eyes looking at his bed, now saturated with the scent of cats. Frank sat down beside Winston, stroking his thick fur. "This isn't right, old friend," he whispered. "We need to help you find your voice again." The next day, Frank returned with a book. He placed it on the coffee table low enough for Winston to see the title, "How to Teach Dogs to Assert Themselves." Winston couldn't read, but he could sense the change in Frank. His voice was more determined, his gaze more resolute, and the next morning, something strange happened. Frank led Winston into the bathroom where there was a large mirror. They stood together, reflected in the mirror, a middle-aged man and a German shepherd, looking back at themselves with confusion. "Winston, look in the mirror," Frank said, his voice so serious it was almost funny. "We deserve our space." Winston tilted his head. Frank repeated, "We deserve our space." This time, Winston perked up his ears. There was something in Frank's voice, a confidence he hadn't heard in a long time. "Repeat," Frank said, looking directly into Winston's eyes through the mirror. Winston, of course, couldn't repeat verbally, but he stood a little straighter. His tail, usually low, lifted slightly. From the corner of the bathroom, Tiny observed with curiosity. Winston saw the small kitten in the mirror, and old habits made him lower his head. Frank shook his head. "No, Winston. Stand tall, head high." Such training sessions continued for many days. Occasionally, Frank would place Winston's favorite toy on the occupied bed and encourage him to retrieve it. The first few times, Winston didn't even dare approach. When he finally had enough courage, Bossy only needed to hiss slightly for Winston to retreat, tail tucked between his legs. Winston felt ashamed. That night in his dreams, he saw himself as a service dog again, chasing criminals, jumping over fences, brave and strong. He woke in the night, heart racing, a part of that dog still existing somewhere inside. That weekend, Frank took Winston to the local dog park. This place was new to Winston. Previously, Frank had only walked him around the neighborhood. The dog park was filled with happy barking balls flying back and forth and many dogs of all sizes playing. Winston felt uncomfortable. He stood close to Frank, tail, low, ears, flat. "Winston." A deep voice sounded from the left. Winston turned and saw another German shepherd approaching, older with more white fur around the muzzle, but still walking proudly. A veteran, Winston could recognize immediately. "I'm Rex," the old dog said in a way that only other dogs could understand. "You were once one of us, I can tell." Winston nodded slightly. Part of him wanted to stand taller in front of Rex, but now you let yourself be bullied. Rex continued, not judging, just stating a fact. "By cats?" Winston lowered his head, ashamed. "Look at me," Rex commanded, and Winston obeyed immediately, a reflex from his training days. "Do you see how I'm standing? Head high, ears straight, tail up, eyes forward, not to threaten, to show that I know who I am." Winston observed carefully. Indeed, though old Rex still stood with an admirable confidence. "Stand like me," Rex requested. Winston tried to imitate. He raised his head, perked his ears, and lifted his tail a bit. It felt strange, like muscles long unused better. Rex nodded. "Now let's play Tugafoir." They played for the rest of the time at the park. Tugafoir, chase, and simply running beside each other. Winston felt something awakening inside, strength and agility he thought he'd lost. When they rested, Rex shared stories about his time serving in the military. Winston listened, sometimes adding his own stories, memories long unmentioned. When they returned home, Winston entered with a different gait. Not completely confident, but something had changed. When passing Sneaky, lying on the sofa, Winston no longer lowered his head. He looked straight into the bobcat's eyes, and the miracle happened. Sneaky was the first to look away. Frank witnessed this small exchange and smiled. He continued reading the book, turning to the next chapter. The next day, Frank began rearranging furniture in the house. He placed Winston's bed in a corner with walls surrounding it on two sides, creating a clear territory. He also used tape to draw lines on the floor, creating separate areas for Winston and for the Bobcat Kittens. Bossy treated these tape lines as a game. He even scratched some sections as if deliberately challenging. Sneaky ignored them, completely continuing to sneak into any area he wanted. Only Tiny seemed to respect these boundaries, perhaps out of curiosity rather than compliance. Winston observed and learned. He began to understand that real boundaries weren't lines on the floor. Real boundaries were invisible, created by presence and attitude. He noticed how Bossy marked territory not with tape, but with scent and confidence. Winston started leaving his scent more deliberately on toys around his bed and in areas he frequented. A primitive instinct, a reminder that this is mine. Surprisingly, this strategy worked at least with Sneaky and Tiny. They began avoiding Winston's toys. Tiny even started keeping her distance from the bed, though still observing from afar with curious eyes. Bossy, of course, remained a challenge, but Winston began noticing small changes. When he approached the bed with more confident strides, head held high, as Rex had taught, Bossy would sit up and watch, reassessing the situation, instead of immediately hissing. One afternoon when Frank was out, Winston stood at the back door looking into the yard. He took a deep breath, belled, and barked a loud, confident, majestic bark, the bark of a service dog, the bark that said, "This is my territory." From inside the house, the three Bobcat Kittens looked up surprised, especially Tiny, her eyes wide with curiosity. Winston felt something change in the air. A balance of power was shifting. The Bobcat Kittens grew quickly. After a month, they were no longer small, cute creatures. Their wild instincts became increasingly apparent. Bossy became more aggressive, especially when protecting food. Sneaky developed a habit of bringing items to his den, including Frank's socks and Winston's toys. Tiny, though still the smallest, showed the strongest hunting instincts, frequently attacking toys. With remarkable skill, Frank began to worry. He invited veterinarian Grace to come for a consultation. Grace, a middle-aged woman with silver gray hair and wise eyes, sat on the floor observing the dynamics between Winston and the Bobcat Kittens. "They're growing up," she told Frank. "Soon their instincts will be stronger than domestication, especially Bossy." "And Winston?" Frank asked. "He seems to have made progress, but still Winston is learning." Grace smiled. "Not about intimidation or aggression, about natural boundaries. In nature, animals don't always fight, but they always have clear boundaries." Winston listened, understanding more than humans thought. Natural boundaries. That was exactly what he was learning. The incident happened on a rainy evening 2 months after the Bobcat Kittens arrived. Frank was trying to retrieve a bone that Sneaky had hidden under the sofa. Bossy, who always protected the group's treasures, approached. His eyes, narrowed ears, flattened against his head. Frank, not noticing the danger, continued reaching under the chair. In a flash, Bossy lunged, sharp claws grazing Frank's arm. "Ah!" Frank pulled back, a streak of blood appearing on his forearm. Winston was lying nearby. The sound of Frank's pain triggered something deep inside him. Not fear, not anger, but a protective instinct. An instinct he had been trained and perfected in for many years as a service dog. In an instant, Winston stood between Frank and Bossy, not growling, not baring teeth, simply present, head high, ears straight, tail stiff, but not curved upward. A posture not threatening, but confident. Bossy froze. For a moment that felt like eternity, the two animals looked at each other, eye to eye, neither yielding. Finally, the unthinkable happened. Bossy hissed slightly but took a step back, then another step and another, until he was in the corner of the room, still staring but having retreated. Frank, hand covering the scratch, looked at Winston with amazement and pride. "You did it, old friend," he whispered. That night, when everyone went to bed, Winston stood in front of his bed, the bed he hadn't lain on in many weeks. Bossy was lying there as usual, eyes half closed but still watchful. Winston approached his gate, confident but not threatening. He stood beside the bed, looking straight at Bossy, not growling, not baring teeth, simply present with his full self. A minute passed. Then, as if making an important decision, Bossy stood up, stretched, and walked away from the bed. He didn't hiss, didn't look back, simply moved to another corner of the room. Winston lay down on his bed for the first time in many weeks. The scent of Bobcat was still there, but now it mixed with Winston's own scent. He turned 3 times, an old habit, and lay down with a sigh of relief. A new order began to form in the house. Winston had reclaimed his bed and some personal space. Bossy and Sneaky kept their distance, no longer aggressive, but still wary. Interestingly, Tiny, the smallest Bobcat kitten, developed a different relationship with Winston. Sometimes when Frank wasn't paying attention, Tiny would sneak close to Winston and sit nearby, observing with curiosity. Winston, now more confident, allowed this presence. Occasionally on cold nights, he even allowed Tiny to sleep in the corner of his bed. Frank noticed this change and understood that the book had worked. Though not in the way he expected, Winston didn't become aggressive or dominant. He simply found his true self again, confident, calm, and knowing his own value. However, Frank also realized another reality. The Bobcat Kittens had grown too large and wild to stay in the house. They needed natural space and freedom to express their true instincts. He began looking for wildlife preserves that could adopt them. But before any plans could be finalized, another incident occurred. Another stormy night, much like the night the Bobcat Kittens first arrived. Winston woke to small screaming sounds from the backyard. He perked his ears, listening through the rain beating on the windows. The cry came again, weak but clear. Winston knew it was Tiny, and she was in danger. Winston went to Frank's bedside, waking him by pushing his nose into Frank's hand. When Frank opened his eyes, Winston barked urgently, then ran to the back door. Frank, still sleepy, followed. "What's wrong, old friend?" Frank opened the back door. Rain was pouring down heavily, but Winston didn't hesitate. He rushed into the yard, his bark ringing through the rain. Frank quickly put on a raincoat and grabbed a flashlight, following Winston. The light swept across the wet garden, finally stopping at a tall tree at the end of the yard. Tiny was up there clinging to a high branch, soaked and trembling under the tree. Winston stood barking to maintain contact, as if saying, "We're here, stay calm." "Oh dear," Frank sighed. "We need a ladder." While Frank went back to get a ladder, Winston stayed under the tree. Rain poured down his back, but he didn't leave. He had stood in the rain for many hours on missions before he could do it again. Tiny needed to know she wasn't alone. Frank returned with the ladder and climbed up to reach Tiny. The small bobcat was initially frightened, claws gripping the branch tightly. But as Frank patiently approached, Tiny finally allowed herself to be rescued. When Frank brought Tiny to the ground, she immediately ran to Winston, not to attack or threaten, but to seek shelter. She huddled under Winston's large frame, shivering from cold and fear. Winston, somewhat surprised, stood still. He felt a strange sensation, not the instinct to protect territory, but the instinct to protect someone weaker, a feeling he had known well in his days as a service dog. After the rainy night incident, the relationship between Winston and the Bobcat Kittens changed noticeably. Bossy kept his distance, but without the challenging attitude. Sneaky stopped stealing Winston's things, and Tiny began following Winston everywhere like a small apprentice. Frank noticed these changes with a smile, but he also knew a decision had to be made. He had found a wildlife preserve a few hours' drive away that could provide a suitable environment for the growing Bobcat Kittens. "It's best for them," he explained to Winston, as if the dog could understand every word. And in some way, perhaps, Winston did understand. He had seen the changes in the kittens, their wild instincts growing stronger, the house space becoming increasingly cramped for them. The day they took the Bobcat Kittens to the preserve was a clear, sunny day. Frank packed 3 transport cages into the car, each containing a kitten. Winston sat in the passenger seat, his eyes watching the kittens throughout the 2-hour journey. The preserve was a vast forest surrounded by safety fences. The conservation staff welcomed them with friendly smiles and understanding. "They'll be free here," a staff member explained. "Enough space to develop, but still protected from dangers." Frank nodded, a bit of sadness in his eyes. He had grown attached to the kittens, especially Tiny, but he knew this was right. When it came time to release the kittens into their new area, Frank allowed Winston to come along. They stood at the edge of a sparse forest. The 3 transport cages opened. Bossy was the first to dash out without hesitation, disappearing into the bushes within seconds. Sneaky followed, moving quickly but more cautiously, stopping to look around before continuing. Tiny was the last to leave the cage. She stepped out slowly, pausing to look up at Winston one last time. There was something in the small bobcat's gaze, an acknowledgement, perhaps gratitude. Then with a light jump, she too disappeared into the forest. Winston stood there calm and confident, no longer fearful or anxious, just peaceful acceptance that every creature has its own place in this world. When Frank and Winston returned to the now empty house, a sense of peace prevailed. Winston went straight to his bed and lay down, head held high, tail relaxed. No more apprehension. Frank smiled, stroking Winston's thick fur. "You found yourself again, haven't you?" Winston looked up at his owner, his deep brown eyes containing new wisdom. He had learned something from his experience with the Bobcat Kittens, not about dominance or aggression, but about standing firm in himself, about healthy boundaries, and about true confidence. 2 days later, Frank's phone rang. It was Grace, the veterinarian. "Frank, we have an emergency at the clinic. An abandoned puppy needs a foster home. I know this is sudden, but could you and Winston..." Frank looked at Winston, hesitant. "A puppy, a new beginning." Winston looked back,
head tilted to one side, ears perked with curiosity. "Well, come," Frank said. At the clinic, a small puppy was trembling in a cage, a mixed breed with oversized ears and large eyes full of fear. When Grace opened the cage door, the puppy cowered in the corner, too afraid to move. Winston approached, moving slowly and calmly. He stopped in front of the cage, not pressuring, simply present. The puppy looked up, still fearful, but somewhat curious. Slowly, Winston lowered his head, a non-threatening gesture, an invitation. After a long moment, the puppy crept toward the cage door, cautiously sniffing Winston. "Wonderful," Grace whispered. "Winston could be the perfect guide." Frank nodded, surprised but pleased. Winston, once a shy dog in front of Bobcat Kittens, now stood there as a confident protector for a weaker creature. They brought the puppy home. Winston led him throughout the house, patient and calm. And when night fell, he did something surprising. He led the puppy to his bed, the bed he had fought to reclaim, and allowed the puppy to curl up in one corner. Frank watched from the doorway, smiling knowingly. Winston wasn't giving up.
His bed. He was sharing it from a position of strength and confidence, not from fear or submission. As Winston lay down, the puppy huddled beside him, seeking warmth and protection. Winston sighed contentedly. He had come a long way from his early days with the Bobcat Kittens. He had found his voice not to growl or threaten, but to confidently say, "This is me, and I deserve my place in this world." And perhaps, just perhaps, he would teach this puppy the same lesson.